economic development and the state. And we're going to launch this module with two papers. One, a selection from Fanon's famous Wretched of the Earth. And the second, also a condensed version of a book written by Ha-Joon Chang called Kicking Away the Ladder. What I'm trying to do with these two papers is to introduce the context of colonialism, which leads to the very question of development. After all, what we call developing societies are mostly former colonies of Western imperial powers. Colonialism was an act of violence with manifold elements, and we must understand both its political and economic impacts, but also its psychological impacts. So Fanon's piece, in a sense, speaks to the latter, and Ha-Joon Chang's essay really talks about the former. In this piece, Kicking Away the Ladder, Globalization and Economic Development in Historical Perspective, which is a summary of his book with the same title, Chang is trying to provide a historical perspective, a historical context of the current debate on globalization and economic development. To most of those who govern the global economy today, the developed country policymakers, international business leaders, and the international economic organizations, including the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, the solution to the problem of economic development is obvious. What the developing countries need, they argue, is the good economic policies and institutions that the developed countries themselves use in order to develop, such as liberalization of trade and investment and strong patent law. Their belief in their own recommendation is so absolute that in their view, it has to be imposed on the developing countries at all costs, through strong bilateral and multilateral external pressures. The historical fact is, though, that the rich countries did not develop on the basis of the policies and institutions that they now recommend to and often force upon the developing countries. So in this chapter, I will establish this fact and draw from it some implications for today's debates on globalization and economic development. But before doing so, let me first critically examine what I call the, quote, official history of capitalism, which informs these debates. So what is the official history? According to the official history of capitalism, the world economy has developed in the following way over the past few centuries. From the 18th century, Britain proved the superiority of free market and free trade policies by beating interventionist France, its main competitor at the time, and establishing itself as a supreme world economic power. In particular, once it had abandoned its deplorable agricultural protection, for instance, the Corn Law and other remnants of old mercantilist protectionist measures, in 1846, it was able to play the role of the architect and the hegemon of the new liberal world economic order. This liberal world order, perfected around 1870, was based on laissez-faire industrial policies at home, low barriers to the international flows of goods, capital, and labor, and macroeconomic stability, both nationally and internationally, guaranteed by the gold standard and the principle of balanced budgets. A period of unprecedented prosperity followed. As an aside, you should know what the Corn Laws were. The Corn Laws were these protectionist tariffs that are trade restrictions that were enforced in the United Kingdom in the early 19th century. And they didn't refer actually to corn as such, but to various cereal grains. And they were designed to keep grain prices high to favor the domestic producers. Unfortunately, according to the story, things started to go wrong with World War I. In response to the ensuing instability of the world economic and political system, countries started to erect trade barriers again. In 1930, the United States abandoned free trade and raised tariffs with the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which the famous free trade economist Jagdish Bhagwati called the most visible and dramatic act of anti-trade folly. After World War II, so the story goes, some significant progress was made in trade liberalization through the early GATT, that is General Agreement on Trade and Tariff Talks. However, unfortunately, dirigist approaches, dirigist stands for interventionist approaches to economic management, dominated the policy-making scene until the 1970s in the developed world and until the early 1980s in the developing world, and the communist world until its collapse in 1989. Fortunately, it is said, interventionist policies have been largely abandoned across the world since the 1980s with the rise of neoliberalism, which emphasizes the virtues of small government, laissez-faire policies, and international openness. Especially in the developing world, by the late 1970s, economic growth had begun to falter in most countries outside East and Southeast Asia, which were already pursuing quote-unquote good policies of free market and free trade. This growth failure, which often manifested itself in economic crises of the early 1980s, exposed the limitations of old-style interventionism and protectionism. As a result, most developing countries have come to embrace, quote, policy reform in a neoliberal direction. So the last part of the story is when combined with the establishment of new global governance institutions represented by the WTO, these policy changes at the national level have created a new global economic system comparable in its at least potential prosperity only to the earlier golden age of liberalism. As we shall see later, this story paints a fundamentally misleading picture, but a no less powerful one for it. And it should be accepted that there are also some senses in which the late 19th century can indeed be described as the era of laissez-faire. So Chang says something important. He says, yes, there was a period between 1860 and 1880 when the world saw a bit of free trade, non-interventionist policies, etc. But the context is important to remember because the context was that of colonialism, when colonies were forced to practice free trade and were forced to undergo unequal treaties. More importantly, the scope of state intervention before World War II, or at least before World War I, was quite limited by modern standards, mainly for institutional reasons, such as the absence of income tax, the absence of a central bank, and the gold standard. Despite these limitations, as we shall see in the next section, virtually all now developed countries actively used interventionist industrial, trade, and technology policies which were aimed at promoting infant industries during their catch-up periods. Now this turns out to be a central theme in this module, so it's important to try and understand what's going on here. So central bank is also something that's known as the Reserve Bank, and it's an organ of the state. So the states, so when you think about the state assemblage, central bank plays a prominent role in the modern banking system, in the modern monetary system, because the central bank possesses the ability to change the monetary base of that country's economy. Only the central bank can authorize printing more money, changing interest rates, and so on. Now, the gold standard was a sort of international exchange rate where all currencies, international currencies, any country's currency was pegged to the pound sterling. After World War I, the gold standard went through a precarious phase because the Bank of England started to have a liquidity crisis and the gold standard could no longer hold the kind of importance that it had in the 19th century. By the end of World War II, with the Bretton Woods International Monetary Agreement, which I've asked you to read up on, the gold standard was effectively abandoned and there became a sort of a de facto dollar standard. In other words, the world's currencies began to be pegged in relation to the US dollar. So Chang says that if you look at the history of industrial trade and technology policies, there was a widespread use of tariffs and subsidies. Almost all of today's rich countries used tariffs and subsidies to develop their industries in an earlier stage of their development. It is particularly important to note that Britain and the United States, the two countries that are supposed to have reached the summit of the world economy through free market, free trade policy, are actually the ones that most aggressively use protection and subsidies. Contrary to the popular myth, Britain was an aggressive user and in certain areas a pioneer of activist policies intended to promote its industries. Such policies, though limited in scope, date back from the 14th century, Edward III, and the 15th century, Henry VII, in relation to woolen manufacturing, the leading industry of the time. At the time, England was an exporter of raw wool in the Low Countries, and various English monarchs tried to change this by protecting domestic woolen textile producers, taxing raw wool exports, and poaching skilled workers from the Low Countries. So you all already know how this also shifted land relations in England. The capture, the enclosure of the commons, and various impacts associated with that. Particularly between the trade policy reform of its first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, in 1721, and its adoption of free trade around 1860, Britain used very dirigist trade and industrial policies involving measures very similar to those that countries like Japan and Korea later used in order to develop their economies. During this period, protected its industries a lot more heavily than did France, the supposed dirigist counterpoint to its free trade economics, free market system. Germany, another country frequently associated with state interventionism, had much lower tariffs than Britain during this period, although the German states tended to use other means of economic intervention more actively. So Chang quotes this economist from the 19th century, the German economist Friedrich List. It is a very common, clever device that when anyone has attained the summit of greatness, he kicks away the ladder by which he has climbed up in order to deprive others of the means of climbing up after him. In this lies the secret of cosmopolitical doctrine of Adam Smith and of the cosmopolitical tendencies of his great contemporary William Pitt and of all his successors in the British government administrations. Any nation which by means of protective duties and restrictions on navigation has raised her manufacturing power and her navigation to such a degree of development that no other nation can sustain free competition with her, can do nothing wiser than to throw away these ladders of her greatness, to preach to other nations the benefits of free trade, and to declare in penitent tones that she has hitherto wandered in the paths of error and has now for the first time succeeded in discovering the truth, at least 1885. By the time Britain enters into an arena of free trade and starts preaching it, Britain has already gone through a whole series of protectionist periods. So Chang continues, the USA was also the intellectual home of protectionism throughout the 19th century. In fact, it was American thinkers like Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the USA, and now forgotten economist Daniel Raymond, who first systematically developed the so-called infant industry argument, which justifies the protection of manufacturing industries in the less developed economies. Indeed, List, who is commonly known as the father of the infant industry argument, started out as a free trader and learned about the Hamiltonian infant industry argument during his exile in the United States during the 1920s. In heavily protecting their industries, the Americans were going directly against the advice of such prominent economists as Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say, who saw their country's future in agriculture. However, they knew exactly what the game was. They knew that Britain had reached the top through protection and subsidies, and therefore that they needed to do the same. Criticizing the British preaching of free trade to his country, Ulysses Grant, the Civil War hero and the US president between 1868 and 1876, retorted that, quote, within 200 years, when America has gotten out of protection all that it can offer, it too will adopt free trade, end quote. So you see how the US is making this argument in the 19th century that an infant industry and protection of an industry is important, and that free trade rules are for people who have acquired 200 years of free trade, as Ulysses Grant puts it. So you see here an argument where the early American presidents were protectionist, and they argued in favor of protectionism, saying that it will take some time to compete with the likes of Britain, which had already protected its markets and had become a dominant global power as a result. The story is similar in relation to institutional development, Chang says. Contrary to what is assumed by today's development orthodoxy, Most of the institutions that are regarded as prerequisites for economic development emerged after and not before a significant degree of economic development in the now developed countries took place. Right? Without claiming to be exhaustive, let's examine the 6 categories of institutions that are widely believed to be prerequisites of development: democracy, bureaucracy, intellectual property rights, institutions of corporate governance, financial institutions, and welfare and labor institutions. So Chang goes through these and points out that almost in every single instance, there were protections, there were ways in which these institutions did not follow the sort of rules that have been prescribed for today's developing countries. So in conclusion, he says if the policies and institutions that the rich countries are recommending to the poor countries are not the ones that they themselves used when they were developing, what is going on? We can only conclude that whether intentionally or not, the rich countries are effectively kicking away the ladder that allowed them to climb to where they are now. It is no coincidence that economic development has become more difficult during the last 2 decades, when the now developed countries have been turning up the pressure on the developing countries to adopt so-called good policies and institutions. Their average annual per capita income growth rate has been halved from 3% to 1.5% between the 1960 to 1980 period and the 80 to 2000 period. And even this disappointing growth rate could not have been achieved except for the high growths in large countries like India and China, which have not followed the orthodox strategy, but have reformed and opened up their economies at their own pace. But during this period, Latin America has virtually stopped growing because Latin America has been among the regions with the most pressure to adopt these neoliberal policies. Sub-Saharan Africa too, and most ex-communist countries also under similar forms of pressure, and they haven't experienced the kind of economic growth that East Asia and South Asia have. Economic instability has increased markedly, as manifested in the dozens of financial crises we have witnessed over the last decade alone. Income inequality has been growing in many developing countries, and poverty has increased rather than decreased in a significant number of them. He asks what can be done to reverse the situation or to address these conditions. He says, first, facts about the historical experiences need to be known, they need to be widely publicized. Second, the conditions attached to bilateral and multilateral financial assistance should be radically changed, so that the Washington Consensus and these forms of conditionalities that are imposed on developing countries and emerging countries need to be reduced, need to be loosened up quite a bit. Third, the WTO rules should be rewritten so that the developing countries can more actively use tariffs and subsidies for industrial development. They should also be allowed to have less stringent patent laws and other intellectual property rights laws. And fourth, improvements in institutions should be encouraged, but they should not be equated with imposing a fixed set of, in practice today's, not even yesterday's Anglo-American institutions on all countries. There need to be more serious attempts, both at the academic and practical levels, to explore exactly which institutions are necessary or at least beneficial for what types of countries, given their stages of development and their economic, political, social, and even cultural conditions. By having the freedom to choose policies and institutions that are more suitable to their conditions, developing countries will be able to develop faster. This will also benefit the developed countries in the long run, as it will increase their trade and investment opportunities. That the developed countries cannot see this is the tragedy of our time. So moving on to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, we're looking at his first chapter called On Violence. And to begin, he says, national liberation, national reawakening, restoration of the nation to the people of Commonwealth, whatever the name used, whatever the latest expression, decolonization is always a violent event. At whatever level we study it, individual encounters, a change of name for a sports club, the guest list at a cocktail party, members of a police force, or the board of directors of a state or private bank, decolonization is simply the substitution of one species, within quotes, of mankind by another. The substitution is unconditional, absolute, total, and seamless. We could go on to portray the rise of a new nation, the establishment of a new state, its diplomatic relations, and its economic and political orientation. But instead, we have decided to describe the kind of tabula rasa which, from the outset, defines any decolonization. Fanon talks about decolonization process as already. So if decolonization is a change in institutions, a change in practices and habits, and so on, the need for this change exists in a raw, repressed, and reckless state in the lives and consciousness of colonized men and women. The eventuality of such a change is also experienced as a terrifying future in the consciousness of another species of men and women, the colonists. So what exactly is decolonization? Decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is clearly an agenda for total disorder. But it cannot be accomplished by the wave of a magic wand, a natural cataclysm, or a gentleman's agreement. Decolonization, we know, is a historical process. In other words, it can only be understood, it can only find its significance and become self-coherent insofar as we can discern the history-making movement which gives it form and substance. So decolonization is a process, it's an encounter between two congenitally antagonistic forces that in fact owe their singularity to the kind of reification secreted and nurtured by the colonial situation. Their first confrontation was colored by violence, and their cohabitation, or rather the exploitation of the colonized by the colonizer, continued at the point of the bayonet and under cannon fire. The colonist and the colonized are old acquaintances, and consequently, the colonist is right when he says he quote-unquote knows them. It is the colonist who fabricated and continues to fabricate the colonized subject. The colonist derives his validity, i.e. his wealth, from the colonial system. So you see this dramatic socio-psychological saga of colonialism. During the course of the several pages that make up this chapter, the term colonial subject continues to haunt the text. Decolonization implies the urgent need to thoroughly challenge the colonial situation. Its definition can, if you want to describe it accurately, be summed up in the well-known words, quote, "the last shall be first," end quote. It's a reversal, it's an upset. Decolonization is verification of this. At a descriptive level, therefore, any decolonization is a success. The violence which governed the ordering of the colonial world, which tirelessly punctuated the destruction of the indigenous social fabric and demolished unchecked the systems of reference of the country's economy, lifestyles, and modes of dress, this same violence will be vindicated and appropriated when, taking history into their own sides, into their own hands, colonized swarm into the forbidden cities. So the decolonization is a revolutionary moment. To blow the colonial world to smithereens is henceforth a clear image within the grasp and imagination of every colonized subject. To dislocate the colonial world does not mean that once the borders have been eliminated, there will be a right of way between the two sectors. To destroy the colonial world means nothing less than demolishing the colonist sector, burying it deep within the earth, or banishing it from the territory. Fanon says that on the one hand, the colonist treats the colonized as evil, treats him with contempt, but on the other hand, is also anxious to create or seek contact with colonized elites. It is with this elite that the famous dialogue on values is established, when the colonialist bourgeoisie internalized or never really took as his or her own. All he has ever seen on his land is that he can be arrested, beaten, and starved with impunity, and no sermonizer on morals, no priest has ever stepped in to bear the blows in his place or share his bread. On the other hand, the intellectual, who for his part has adopted the abstract universal values of the colonizer, is prepared to fight so that colonist and colonized can live in peace in a new world. But what he does not see, precisely because colonialism and all its modes of thought have seeped into him, is that the colonist is no longer interested in staying on and coexisting once the colonial context has disappeared. It is no coincidence that even before any negotiation between the Algerian government and the French government, the so-called liberal European minority has already made its position clear. It is clamoring for dual citizenship, nothing less. By sticking to the abstract, the colonist is being forced to make a very substantial leap into the unknown. Let us be honest, the colonist knows perfectly well that no jargon is a substitute for reality. For the bourgeois colonized subject, he just thus discovers that his life, his breathing, and his heartbeats are the same as the colonists. He discovers that the skin of a colonist is not worth more than the natives. In other words, his world receives a fundamental jolt. The colonized revolutionary new assurance stems from this. Fanon clearly has a lot of anger and animosity towards the colonized intellectual because, on the one hand, decolonization means that the last should become first, but the colonized intellectual introduces a variation on this demand, and in fact, there seems to be no lack of motivation to fill senior positions as administrators, technicians, and experts. The colonized, however, equate this nepotism with acts of sabotage. And it is not unusual to hear them declare, what is the point of being independent then? Wherever an authentic liberation struggle has been fought, wherever the blood of the people has been shed, and the armed phase has lasted long enough to encourage the intellectuals to withdraw to their rank and file place, there is an effective eradication of the superstructure borrowed by these intellectuals from the colonialist bourgeois circles. In other words, this is no longer possible to have an easy shift from a colonial situation to a decolonized situation or a post-colonial situation where the superstructure remains intact, that is, the culture and the practices of the institutions remain intact in cases where there has been a long liberation struggle. Fanon goes on to describe various other social and psychological effects as a result, as an outcome of the decolonizing process. But this isn't because of decolonization as such, but it is the violence caused by the colonial situation itself which produces these kinds of effects. For instance, at the individual level, we witness a genuine negation of common sense. Whereas the colonist or police officer can beat the colonized subject day in and day out, insult him and shove him to his knees, it is not uncommon to see the colonized subject draw his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive look from another colonized subject. For the colonized subject's last resort is to defend his personality against his fellow countryman. Internecine feuds merely perpetuate old grudges, age-old grudges, entrenched in memory. By throwing himself, muscle and soul, into his blood feuds, the colonized subject endeavors to convince himself that colonialism has never existed, that everything as it used to be. By throwing himself, muscle and soul, into his blood feuds, the colonized subject endeavors to convince himself that colonialism has never existed, that everything is as it used to be, and history marches on. Here we grasp the full significance of the all too familiar head in the sand behavior at a collective level, as if this collective immersion in a fratricidal bloodbath suffices to mask the obstacle and postpone the inevitable alternative, the inevitable emergence of the armed struggle against colonialism. Fanon goes on to say that there are many other social psychological effects that one sees in this relationship between the colonized subject and the colonists, and among colonized subjects themselves. At the individual level, we witness a genuine negation of common sense. Whereas the colonist or police officer can beat the colonized subject day in and day out, insult him and shove him to his knees, it is not uncommon to see the colonized subject draw his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive look from another colonized subject. For the colonized subject's last resort is to defend his personality against his fellow countryman. Internecine feuds merely perpetuate age-old grudges entrenched in memory. By throwing himself muscle and soul into his blood feuds, the colonized subject endeavors to convince himself that colonialism has never existed, that everything is as it used to be, and history marches on. Here we grasp the full significance of the all too familiar head in the sand behavior at a collective level, as if this collective immersion in a fratricidal bloodbath suffices to mask the obstacle and postpone the inevitable alternative, the inevitable emergence of the armed struggle against colonialism. So colonialism produces and reproduces this kind of dérèglement, what Durkheim calls a sort of disorder, a collective madness. Furthermore, in the colonial world, the colonized affectivity is kept on edge like a running sword flinching from a caustic agent. And the psyche retracts, it is obliterated, and finds an outlet through muscular spasms that have caused many an expert to classify the colonized as hysterical. This overexcited affectivity, spied on by invisible guardians who constantly communicate with the core of the personality, takes an erotic delight in the muscular deflation of the crisis. Another aspect of the colonized affectivity can be seen when it is drained of energy by the ecstasy of dance. Any study of the colonial world must therefore include an understanding of the phenomena of dance and possession. The colonized way of relaxing is precisely this muscular orgy during which the most brutal aggressiveness and impulsive violence are channeled, transformed, and spirited away. We have seen that this violence throughout the colonial period, although constantly on edge, runs on empty. We have seen it channeled through the emotional release of dance or possession. We have seen it exhaust itself in fratricidal struggles. The challenge now is to seize this violence as it realigns itself, whereas it once rebelled in myths and contrived ways to commit collective suicide, a fresh set of circumstances will now enable it to change directions. So Fanon here is talking about rechanneling this energy towards the revolution. But the revolutionary moment itself is fraught with difficulties and challenges and contradictions, even as different groups are aligned along different alignments, different kinds of conditions and alignments. At the critical deciding moment, the colonialist bourgeoisie, which had remained silent up till then, enters the fray. They introduce a new notion, and in actual fact, a creation of the colonial situation, non-violence. In its raw state, this non-violence conveys to the colonized intellectual and business elite that their interests are identical to those of the colonialist bourgeoisie, and it is therefore indispensable, a matter of urgency, to reach an agreement for the common good. Non-violence is an attempt to settle the colonial problem around the negotiating table before the irreparable is done, before any bloodshed or regrettable act is committed. Fanon goes on to talk about the strategies of the colonized as well as the colonists. So at the start of colonization, a single military column could occupy a vast amount of territory from the Congo and Nigeria to the Ivory Coast, etc. But today, the national struggle of the colonized is part and parcel of an entirely new situation. Capitalism, in its expansionist phase, regarded the colonies as a source of raw materials, which once processed could go unloaded on the European market. After a phase of capital accumulation, capitalism has now modified its notion of profitability. The colonies have become a market. The colonial population is a consumer market. Consequently, if the colony has to be constantly garrisoned, if trade slumps, in other words, if manufactured and industrial goods can no longer be exported, This is proof that the military solution must be ruled out. A blind domination on the model of slavery is not economically profitable for the metropolis. The monopolistic fraction of the metropolitan bourgeoisie will not support a government whose policy is based solely on the power of arms. What the metropolitan financiers and industrialists expect is not the devastation of the colonial population, but the protection of their legitimate interests, including using economic agreements. Capitalism, therefore, objectively colludes with the forces of violence that erupt in colonial territories. Moreover, the colonized subject is not alone in the face of the oppressor. There is, of course, the political and diplomatic aid of the progressive countries and their peoples, but above all, there is a competition and the pitiless war waged by the financial groups. The Conference of Berlin was able to carve up a mutilated Africa among 3 or 4 European flags. This happened at the end of the 19th century. Currently, the issue is not whether an African region is under French or Belgian sovereignty, but whether the economic zones are safeguarded. So Fanon says there's a sort of a moderate approach to this, where nationalist reformist movements, often a caricature of trade unionism, decides to act. It does so using extremely peaceful methods, organizing work stoppages in the few factories located in the towns, mass demonstrations to cheer a leader, and a boycott of the buses or imported commodities. All these methods not only put pressure on the colonial authorities, but also allow the people to let off steam. This hibernation therapy, this hypnotherapy of the people sometimes succeeds. And here Fanon says, the colonialist bourgeoisie is aided and abetted in the pacification of the colonized by the inescapable powers of religion. All the saints who turned the other cheek, who forgave those who trespassed against them, who without flinching was spat upon and insulted, are championed and shown as an example. The elite of the colonized countries, whose emancipated slaves, once they are at the head of the movement, inevitably end up producing an ersatz struggle. They use the term slavery of their brothers to shame the slave drivers or to provide their oppressors, financial competitors, with an ideology of insipid humanitarianism. Never, in fact, do they actually appeal to the slaves. Never do they actually mobilize them. On the contrary, at the moment of truth, for them, the lie, they brandish the threat of mass mobilization as a decisive weapon that would, as if by magic, put an end to the colonial regime. There are revolutionaries, obviously within these political parties, among the cadres, who deliberately turn their backs on the farce of national independence. But their speeches, their initiatives, and their angry outbursts very soon antagonize the party machine. These factions are gradually isolated, then removed altogether. At the same time, as if there were a dialectical concomitance, the colonial police swoops down upon them. Hounded in the towns, shunned by the militants, rejected by the party leaders, these undesirables, with their inflammatory attitude, end up in the countryside. It is then they realize, in a kind of intoxication, that the peasant masses latch on to their every word and do not hesitate to ask them the question for which they are not prepared. When do we start? And here again, sometimes even these politicians declare, we blacks, we Arabs, and these terms charged with ambivalence during the colonial period take on a sacred connotation. These nationalist politicians are playing with fire. As an African leader recently told a group of young intellectuals, think before speaking to the masses. They are easily excitable. This is therefore a cunning of history which plays havoc with the colonies. Colonized peoples are not alone, Fanon says. Despite the efforts of colonialism, their frontiers remain permeable to news and rumors. They discover that violence is atmospheric. It breaks out sporadically and here and there sweeps away the colonial regime. The success of this violence plays not only an informative role, but also an operative one. The great victory of the Vietnamese people at Dien Bien Phu is no longer, strictly speaking, a Vietnamese victory. From July 1954 onward, the colonial peoples have been asking themselves, what must we do to achieve a Dien Bien Phu? How should we go about it? A Dien Bien Phu was within reach of every colonized subject. The problem was mustering forces, organizing them, and setting a date for action. This pervading atmosphere of violence affects not just the colonized, but also the colonizers, who realize the number of latent Dien Bien Phus. Colonial governments are therefore gripped in a genuine wholesale panic. Their plan is to make the first move to turn the liberation movement to the right and disarm the people. Quick, let's decolonize. Let's decolonize Congo. Let's decolonize Congo before it turns into another Algeria. Let's vote a blueprint for Africa. Let's create the Let's vote a blueprint for Africa. Let's create the communauté for Africa. Let's modernize it, but for God's sake, let's decolonize. Let's decolonize. They decolonized at such a pace that they forced independence on Houphouët Boigny. In answer to the strategy of a Dien Bien Phu, defined by the colonizer, replies with the strategy of containment, respecting the sovereignty of nations. In his impatience, the fact that the colonized subject brandishes the threat of violence proves that he is aware of the exceptional nature of the current situation and that he intends to make the most of it. But also on a more immediate personal level, as he sees the modern world penetrate the remotest corners of the interior, he becomes acutely aware of everything he does not possess. The masses, by a kind of infantile reasoning, are convinced they have been robbed. In certain developing countries, therefore, they're quick to catch on and realize 2 or 3 years after independence, their hopes have been dashed. What was the point of fighting if nothing was really destined to change? In 1789, after the bourgeois French Revolution, the humblest French peasant gained substantially from the upheaval. But it is common knowledge that for 95% of the population in developing countries, independence has not brought any immediate change. Any observer with a keen eye is aware of a kind of latent discontent which, like glowing embers, constantly threatens to flare up again. In between, Fanon talks about how socialist countries have been supportive of the movements of the colonized and how that has sort of emboldened them. Heartened by the unconditional support of the socialist countries, the colonized hurl themselves with whatever weapons they possess against the impregnable citadel of colonialism. Although the citadel is invincible against knives in their hands, its invincibility crumbles when we take into account the context of the Cold War. In this new context, the Americans take their role as barons of international capitalism very seriously. At first, they advise the European countries to decolonize on gentlemen's terms. In a second phase, they have no hesitation, first proclaiming their respect, then their support for the principle, Africa for Africans. Today, the US has no qualms officially declaring they are the defenders of the right of peoples to self-determination. The latest voyage by Mr. Menon Williams illustrates all too well the American consciousness that the Third World must not be sacrificed. Understandably, violence is a desperate act only if it is compared in abstracto to the military machine of the oppressors. On the other hand, violence in the context of international relations, we realize, represents a formidable threat to the oppressor. Persistent jacqueries and Mau Mau agitation disrupt the economic life of a colony, but pose no threat to the metropolis. A greater threat, as far as imperialism is concerned, is that socialist propaganda might infiltrate the masses and contaminate them. It is already a serious risk running the conflict's cold period, but what would happen to the colony rotted by bloody guerrilla warfare in the event of a real war? So Fanon advances the brilliant and extravagant thesis that what ensues is capitalism's calculation that it's best to try and keep the peace and maintain or build up an ideology of peaceful coexistence. But Soon enough, there's a revolutionary phase, and by this time, all bets are off. We're here by the force of the bayonet. Everyone knows the rest of the quote. During the insurrectional stage, every colonist reasons on the basis of simple arithmetic. Such a logic is no surprise to the other colonists, but it is important to point out that it's no surprise to the colonized either. And first and foremost, stating the principle, quote, it's them or us, is not a paradox, since colonialism, as we have seen, is precisely the organization of a Manichean world, of a compartmentalized world. And when advocating an exact line of procedure, the colonists ask every representative of the oppressor minority to take out 30 or 100 or 200 natives. He realizes there's no outcry of indignation, and that at the most, the issue boils down to whether it can be done in one stage or in stages. This line of reasoning, which envisages the surgical elimination of the colonized, does not morally upset the colonized subject. He has always known that his dealings with the colonist would take place in a field of combat. So the colonized subject wastes no time lamenting and almost never searches for justice in the colonial context. In fact, if the colonist's argument leaves the colonized subject unmoved, it is because the latter poses the issue of his liberation in virtually identical terms. Let us form groups of 200 or 500 and let each group deal with a colonist. For the colonized, this violence represents the absolute praxis. The militant, therefore, is the one who works. The questions which the organization asks the militant bear the mark of this vision of things. Where have you worked? With whom? What have you accomplished? The group requires each individual to have performed an irreversible act. In Algeria, for example, where almost all the men who called on the people to join the national struggle were sentenced to death or wanted by the French police, trust was proportionate to the desperate nature of each case. A militant could be trusted only when he could no longer return to the colonial system. Such a mechanism apparently existed in Kenya with the Mau Mau, who required every member of the group to strike the victim. Everyone was therefore personally responsible for the death of the victim. To work means to work towards the death of the colonist. Fanon goes on to portray the familial tragedy of violence in Aimé Césaire's poetry. Let us recall one of the most decisive pages of his tragedy, where the rebel, what a coincidence, proclaims, rebel, toughly, my family name offended, my given name humiliated, my profession rebel, my age the Stone Age, mother, my race the human race, my religion brotherhood, rebel, my race the fallen race, my religion. But it is not you who will prepare for it with your disarmament. It is I with my revolt and my poor clenched fists and my bushy head. I recall a November day. He was not 6 months old, and the master came into the shack, murky as an April moon, and he was probing the child's small muscle limbs. He was a very good master. He ran his fat fingers carelessly across his little dimpled face. His blue eyes were laughing, and his mouth was teasing him with sugary things. This one will make a good one, the master said, looking at me. And he was saying other friendly things, the master was. And you had to start very early, that 20 years were not too much to make a good Christian and a good slave, a good subject, utterly devoted, a good slave driver for an overseer with a sharp eye and a strong arm. And this man was speculating over my son's cradle, a slave driver's cradle. Mother, alas, you will die. Rebel. I killed him with my own hands. Yes, a fecund and copious death. It was night. We crawled through the sugarcane. The cutlasses were chortling at the stars, but we didn't care about the stars. The cane slashed our faces with streams of green blades. Mother, I had dreamed of a son who would close his mother's eyes. Rebel, I chose to open my child's eyes to another son. Mother, oh my son, an evil and pernicious death Mother, a verdant and sumptuous death. Mother, from too much hate, rebel. From too much love, mother. Spare me, I'm choking from your shackles, bleeding from your wounds, rebel. And the world does not spare me. There is not in the world one single poor lynched bastard, one poor tortured man in whom I am not also murdered and humiliated. God in heaven, deliver him. Rebel. My heart, you will not deliver me of my memories. It was a November night, and suddenly clamors lit up the silence. We had leapt, we the slaves, we the manure, we beasts with patient hooves. We were running like lunatics. Fiery shots broke out. We were striking. Sweat and blood cooled us off. We were striking. Amidst the screams and the screams became more strident, and a great clamor rose towards the east. The outbuildings were burning, and the flames sweetly splashed our cheeks. Then came the attack on the master's house. They were shooting from the windows. We forced the doors. The master's bedroom was wide open. The master's bedroom was brilliantly lit, and the master was there, very calm, and all of us stopped. He was the master. I entered. It's you, he said, very calmly. It was me. It was indeed me. I told him, the good slave, the faithful slave, the slave, and suddenly my eyes were two cockroaches, frightened on a rainy day. I struck, the blood spurted. It is the only baptism that today I remember. And here we come to some key parts of the text. The violence of the colonized, we have said, unifies the people. By its very structure, colonialism is separatist and regionalist. Colonialism is not merely content to note the existence of tribes. It reinforces and differentiates them. The colonial system nurtures the chieftainships and revives the old Marabout confraternities. Violence in its practice is totalizing and national. As a result, it harbors in its depths the elimination of regionalism and tribalism. The nationalist parties, therefore, show no pity at all towards the Qaids and the traditional chiefs. The elimination of the Qaids and the chiefs is a prerequisite to the unification of the people. At the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence. Even if the armed struggle has been symbolic, and even if it has been demobilized by rapid decolonization, the people have time to realize that liberation was the achievement of each and every one, and no special merit should go to the leader. Violence hoists the people up to the level of the leader. Hence the aggressive tendency to distrust the system of protocol that young governments are quick to establish. And here Fanon comes to the tragic aspects of the decolonizing project. Today, national independence and nation building in the underdeveloped regions take on an entirely new aspect. In these regions, except for some remarkable achievements, every country suffers from the same lack of infrastructure. The masses battle with the same poverty, wrestle with the same age-old gestures, and delineate what we would call the geography of hunger with their shrunken bellies. There's a wonderful book, by the way, by Francois Bayard called Africa and the Politics of the Belly. A world of underdevelopment, a world of poverty and inhumanity, but also a world without doctors, without engineers, without administrators. Facing this world, the European nations wallow in the most ostentatious opulence. This European opulence is literally a scandal, for it was built on the backs of slaves. And here you see a very neat connection to Ha-Joon Chang's chapter. And this we are determined never to forget. When a colonialist country, embarrassed by a colony's demand for independence, proclaims, with the nationalist leaders in mind, if you want independence, take it and return to the Dark Ages. The newly independent people nod their approval and take up the challenge. And what we actually see is the colonizer withdrawing his capital and technicians and encircling the young nation with an apparatus of economic pressure. And he goes on to describe a whole set of other conditions that have helped dehumanize the colonized and the newly independent countries that start from this animal level, he says. The truth is, we must not accept such conditions. We must refuse outright the situation to which the West wants to condemn us. Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn their flag and their police force from our territories. For centuries, the capitalists have behaved like real war criminals in the underdeveloped world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the primary methods used by capitalism to increase its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and power. Not so long ago, Nazism transformed the whole of Europe into a genuine colony. The governments of various European nations demanded reparations and the restitution in money and kind for their stolen treasures. As a result, cultural artifacts, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows were returned to their owners. In order to invest in the independent countries, private companies demand terms which from their experience prove unacceptable or unfeasible. True to their principle of immediate returns as soon as they invest overseas, capitalists are reluctant to invest in the long term. They're recalcitrant and often openly hostile to the so-called economic planning programs of the young regimes, of the young post-colonial regimes. At most, they are willing to lend capital to the young nations on condition that it is used to buy manufactured goods and machinery and therefore keep factories in the metropolis running. In fact, the Western financiers are wary of any form of risk-taking. Their demands, therefore, are for political stability and a peaceful social climate, which are impossible to achieve given the appalling situation of the population as a whole in the aftermath of independence. In their search, then, for a guarantee which the former colony cannot vouch for, they demand that certain military bases be kept on and the young nation enter into military and economic agreements. The private companies put pressure on their own government to ensure that the troops stationed in these countries are assigned to protecting their interests. As a last resort, these companies require their governments to guarantee their investments in such and such an underdeveloped region. As a result, few countries meet the conditions required by the cartels and monopolies. So the capital, deprived of reliable outlets, remains blocked in Europe and frozen, especially as the capitalists refuse to invest in their own country. Returns in this case are in fact minimal, and fiscal pressure disheartens the boldest. The situation in the long term is catastrophic. Capital no longer circulates, or else is considerably reduced. The Swiss banks refuse funding, and Europe suffocates. Despite the enormous sums swallowed by military expenditures, international capitalism is in desperate straits. So one of the themes Fanon is pursuing here is something that is familiar to many, especially Marxist political economists from the 70s through the current period, trying to look at the periodic crises of capitalism. This is beautifully explained in some of the videos by David Harvey, in case you're interested in finding out more about capitalism's inherent tendency for crisis. So brandishing the third world as a flood which threatens to engulf the whole of Europe will not divide the progressive forces whose intentions are to lead humanity in the pursuit of happiness. The third world has no intention of organizing a vast hunger crusade against Europe. What it does expect from those who have kept it in slavery for centuries is to help it rehabilitate man and ensure his triumph everywhere, once and for all. But it is obvious we are not so naive as to think this will be achieved with the cooperation and goodwill of the European governments. This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issues. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, to put on their thinking caps and stop playing the irresponsible game of sleeping beauty.